The morning of December 16, 1944, was unlike anything the soldiers on the front lines had ever witnessed. The ground shook beneath their boots as American artillery shells screamed overhead, seemingly determined to find their mark. But this wasn't ordinary artillery fire. Something in the air felt different. As the soldiers huddled down, waiting for the explosions, they quickly realized that the shell fire wasn't just about the blasts hitting the ground. It was something else, something far more terrifying. These shells weren't hitting the trees, the earth, or the trenches. They were detonating above in midair, sending a deadly rain of fragments in every direction. The Germans, advancing under the banner of Operation Watch on the Rhine, found themselves caught in something they couldn't comprehend. It was a moment of pure devastation, a turn in the tide that would go on to change the nature of warfare forever. These soldiers, some of the most battle-hardened veterans from the Eastern Front, had seen their fair share of artillery. But what they were experiencing now was not the war they knew. Death was no longer just a matter of shells hitting the ground. It was a new kind of precision, a weapon that seemed to understand where they were before they even knew it was coming. For Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson, in charge of the 406th Artillery Group, this moment was going to be one of the most consequential in the history of the war. What started as an unauthorized decision to use proximity fuses in artillery shells would soon become the game changer that would tip the scales in favor of the Allies. Imagine the scene. German soldiers moving forward in their usual tactical formations, foxholes dug deep, trenches for cover, and the familiar artillery fire in the distance. This was the art of war they had mastered. But today everything changed. Colonel Axelson, in a desperate attempt to save his unit, ordered that the fuses be deployed in a way they hadn't been before, above the heads of the advancing German troops, not on the ground. What Axelson didn't know was that his decision would not only save American lives but also completely alter the way the world understood artillery combat. Now, let's pause for a second and think about what makes war so terrifying. It's the unknown, the unpredictability. And here in the frozen forest of the Ardennes, that fear was about to hit the Germans like a thunderclap. These weren't just shells fired from a distance. These were proximity fuses, miniature radar systems inside artillery shells designed to detonate at an optimal height, no matter where the target was hiding. The science behind these fuses was beyond anything the Germans had ever seen. They didn't just explode on impact, they exploded in the perfect place, in midair, maximizing the destruction. For the men on the ground, this was no longer a traditional war. The rules had changed, and they were about to experience a kind of terror that no military doctrine had ever prepared them for. German soldiers who had spent years fighting across Europe, entrenched in their familiar tactics, now found themselves in an entirely different kind of battlefield. The usual tactics, ducking into a foxhole or hiding behind a tree, were no longer viable options. The air was alive with lethal steel fragments falling from the sky, and they had nowhere to hide. Imagine the confusion and terror of facing an invisible enemy, one that knew where you were before you could even react. This wasn't just about shooting. It was about precision, technology, and innovation. The proximity fuses were a technological marvel. They represented the pinnacle of American scientific achievement during the war. Each fuse contained a miniature radar system, capable of detecting targets even in the most difficult of weather conditions, and with the ability to detonate at exactly the right height above the ground, ensuring that no enemy could escape the devastation. Unlike conventional artillery, which relied on shells either hitting the ground or exploding at a timed interval, these fuses allowed for an airburst, sending a lethal shower of steel and shrapnel over a vast area. And the way the Americans managed to create these fuses, well, that's a story of its own. It wasn't just a question of putting together a radar system. It was a matter of combining the most sophisticated electronic components of the time, including tiny vacuum tubes, all packed into a shell no bigger than a coffee can. The challenge of making something so precise, so reliable, and so small was a feat that most engineers thought impossible. Yet by 1944, this technology was being mass-produced at an industrial scale, with thousands of these fuses rolling off assembly lines every day. This level of production, this industrial scale, was what truly set the Americans apart. Now imagine the moment the Germans first encountered the effects of these fuses. They were advancing, expecting to face the same kind of artillery they had encountered throughout the war, predictable, easy to counter, and manageable. But this was something they couldn't escape. The airburst from the proximity fuses rained down upon them, exploding over their heads with mathematical precision. The Germans, trained to survive conventional artillery, suddenly found themselves helpless. Foxholes and trenches, which had been their saving grace, were no longer safe havens. These fuses didn't just hit the ground, they were designed to hit their enemies where they couldn't escape, in the air above them. This was the beginning of a shift in the war. The Germans, caught off guard, faced a weapon that was unlike anything they had ever seen before. The standard tactics they had relied on for years, moving in formations, hiding in trenches, taking cover behind trees, became useless. With proximity fuses, the very landscape of warfare had changed, and the Germans, despite their advancements, were caught in a race they didn't know they were losing. To put this into perspective, think about the numbers. In just a matter of days, Colonel Axelson's decision would have an unimaginable impact. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, for example, fired more than 7,600 rounds, some of which were proximity fused. These weren't just numbers. They were lives lost, strategies disrupted, and the very fabric of the German offensive shattered. With these fuses, the Allies didn't just hold their ground, they dominated it. By December 19th, just a few days after Colonel Axelson's bold move, American artillery was equipped with proximity fuses in full force, making their way to every frontline artillery unit across the Ardennes. The scale of this technological revolution was staggering. These fuses turned artillery into something far more precise, far more effective. No longer did artillery require painstaking adjustments by forward observers. The fuses took care of the timing and targeting. The result was a devastatingly efficient weapon that could strike anywhere, anytime with pinpoint accuracy. The Germans, upon realizing the effectiveness of this new weapon, were left in a state of disbelief. They had no countermeasure, no way of understanding what was happening. Their battle-hardened troops, used to facing all kinds of weapons, were now facing something that seemed to anticipate their every move. Imagine the fear that would spread among soldiers who, one moment, thought they were safe, only to be obliterated the next by an unseen force. This was the psychological impact of proximity fuses. They were no longer just fighting a war. They were fighting against a technological adversary that had changed the rules completely. As the battle continued, the American forces, equipped with this new weapon, began to push the Germans back. The proximity fuse, originally a secret weapon, had transformed the battlefield. What was once a fight for survival had now become a battle of technological supremacy. The Germans, despite their bravery and skill, were outmatched by a weapon they couldn't comprehend, a weapon that would continue to evolve and shape the future of warfare. In the end, the proximity fuse wasn't just a military innovation, it was a revolution in the way wars would be fought in the future. Its impact on the Battle of the Bulge was undeniable. It turned the tide, made the impossible possible, and showcased the power of innovation in the face of adversity. But perhaps most importantly, it served as a testament to the ingenuity of the American people who, in the darkest days of war, found a way to tip the scales in their favor. The proximity fuse wasn't just a tool of war, it was the key to victory. By now, the Germans had no illusions about what they were facing. The battlefield, once familiar and predictable, had transformed into something almost unrecognizable. The proximity fuse had opened a door to a new kind of warfare, one that didn't just rely on sheer firepower or brute strength. It was precise, methodical, and devastating, and the Germans, despite their years of military experience, couldn't adapt fast enough to counter this revolutionary weapon. Imagine the scene. German infantry, used to the grueling, exhausting battles of the Eastern Front, are suddenly thrust into a new kind of fight. They're accustomed to artillery fire that explodes at ground level, a threat they've learned to manage over the years. But now shells are bursting overhead, detonating with unerring precision, cutting down entire units in seconds. The survivors have no time to react, no safe place to hide. The very land they fought for now becomes their enemy. The Germans, already reeling from the pressures of a two-front war, now found themselves confronted by a weapon that leveled the playing field in ways they couldn't have anticipated. For the Americans, the breakthrough came just in time. The Battle of the Bulge, a desperate gamble by Hitler to turn the tide of the war, had begun with tremendous promise for the German forces. The initial surprise attack was overwhelming. German forces, some 200,000 strong, surged forward with an intensity that caught the Allies off guard. They had the element of surprise, the advantage of terrain, and the motivation of a final, all-or-nothing push. Yet, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the unexpected happened. The very weapon that the Germans had no way of understanding began to turn their advantage into a catastrophic disadvantage. The proximity fuse was not just a tool of death. It was a psychological weapon. It broke the spirit of the Germans in ways traditional weapons could never do. As the artillery shells burst overhead, German soldiers could hear the distinct whistling of incoming fire. They could see the flashes in the distance, the sudden eruptions of dirt and debris. But they couldn't escape them. No longer was the threat confined to the ground. It was in the air above them, out of sight, yet with a deadly accuracy that made every movement feel like a death sentence. Even the most seasoned soldiers who had seen their fair share of hell were shaken to their core. They had no way of predicting where the next explosion would come from, no way of outrunning the devastating burst of shrapnel that would descend upon them from above. As word spread of the weapon's effectiveness, the Germans were faced with a new kind of terror. No longer could they count on their entrenched positions. The forests, which had provided some cover, were now death traps. Every tree, every rock, every foxhole was vulnerable. The proximity fuse had turned their familiar terrain into a killing field. They had no place to run, no place to hide. The psychological impact was profound. This was not just about combat. It was about the complete breakdown of tactical norms. The very foundation of their strategy had been shattered. Meanwhile, the Allies were experiencing something they hadn't felt in years: hope. After months of grueling fighting, the proximity fuses gave them the edge they so desperately needed. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, with their 75 mm pack howitzers, had become the spearhead of this new form of warfare. Their shells, equipped with the revolutionary fuses, tore through the enemy with a terrifying efficiency. The German soldiers, caught in the open, faced artillery fire that seemed to know exactly where they were. The concept of escape was no longer viable. They could no longer move without facing certain death. Even the weather, which had been a great equalizer on the battlefield, became irrelevant. Snow, fog, and darkness were no longer safe havens for the Germans. The proximity fuse didn't need a clear line of sight to the target. It could detonate in the air above the soldiers no matter the visibility. For the Germans, this was a nightmare. They had relied on poor weather to shield their movements, to buy themselves time, but now the weather worked against them. No amount of camouflage or cover could protect them from this invisible killer in the sky. The very air became a lethal weapon, and the Germans had no way to defend against it. As the Allies continued to use proximity fuses throughout the Battle of the Bulge, their effectiveness became undeniable. The 969th Artillery Battalion, an all-African-American unit, became a crucial force in the defense of Bastogne. Armed with 155 mm howitzers, they unleashed a barrage of proximity-fused shells on the advancing German forces. The effect was staggering. Entire platoons caught in the open were wiped out in mere seconds. The German soldiers had no warning, no chance to react. The artillery fire was precise, lethal, and unyielding. The Germans, despite their best efforts, found themselves unable to penetrate the American defenses. In the midst of this chaos, General George S. Patton's Third Army was racing to relieve the beleaguered town of Bastogne. As Patton's forces closed in, the proximity fuses continued to wreak havoc on the German lines. Patton, understanding the full potential of this new weapon, ordered a concentration of fire from multiple artillery battalions, all firing proximity-fused shells simultaneously. The result was a devastating wave of destruction that broke the German resolve. The proximity fuse had become a weapon of not just physical destruction, but psychological warfare. The Germans, who had once been confident in their ability to push through the Ardennes, now found themselves on the back foot, reeling from a weapon they couldn't counter, a weapon that seemed to be everywhere, yet nowhere at the same time. It wasn't just the front lines that felt the impact of the proximity fuse. Behind the scenes, the production efforts were staggering. Over 100 American companies, from Crossley to General Electric, had been mobilized to produce proximity fuses at an industrial scale. By December 1944, the factories were working around the clock, producing 40,000 fuses per day. The level of coordination required to pull this off was immense, and it showcased the power of American industry and ingenuity. This wasn't just about firing a shell. It was about mass-producing a weapon that could change the course of a battle, a war, and the future of military combat. The American workforce, driven by patriotism and the sheer urgency of the war effort, produced proximity fuses with a precision that would later become a model for modern supply chains. What made the proximity fuse so revolutionary wasn't just its deadly accuracy. It was the sheer scope of its impact. It fundamentally changed the way battles were fought. No longer could soldiers rely solely on traditional tactics. The proximity fuse had turned artillery into a precision weapon, capable of making decisions on its own and determining the best time to strike. This wasn't just a matter of firepower. It was about creating a weapon that could think for itself, that could adapt to the battlefield conditions and deliver its lethal payload with unparalleled precision. By the end of the Battle of the Bulge, the proximity fuse had proven itself as one of the most effective weapons of the war. It was responsible for saving countless Allied lives, and at the same time, it had dealt a devastating blow to the German forces. The figures spoke for themselves. Of the 200,000 proximity-fused shells fired during the battle, it's estimated that between 15,000 to 20,000 German casualties were directly caused by this new weapon. That's 20% of the total German casualties in one of the most brutal battles of the war. The proximity fuse had rewritten the rules of warfare, and the Germans had been helpless in the face of it. But the true impact of the proximity fuse didn't just end on the battlefield. Its influence stretched far beyond the war itself. The technology behind the fuse paved the way for future advancements in military weaponry, including guided missiles and modern smart bombs. The principles of the proximity fuse, the ability to detect and respond to targets autonomously, would go on to shape the future of warfare. What started as a secret weapon used to turn the tide in the Battle of the Bulge would eventually evolve into the precision-guided munitions that dominate modern conflict. As the war drew to a close, the proximity fuse had already made its mark on history. Its legacy, however, was only just beginning. From its early use in the forests of the Ardennes to its role in the development of modern military technology, the proximity fuse had proven that innovation, no matter how improbable, could change the course of history. The true scope of the proximity fuse's impact became even more evident in the aftermath of the Battle of the Bulge. As the Allies pushed forward and the Germans retreated, it wasn't just the physical destruction that the German soldiers had to contend with. It was the psychological toll of facing an enemy whose technology had rendered them virtually powerless. They had once believed themselves to be the superior force, equipped with better tactics, superior artillery, and the experience to outmaneuver their foes. But now they were faced with a weapon that defied every expectation, every strategy they had ever learned. The proximity fuse was, in many ways, a weapon of terror. It wasn't just about the carnage it caused. It was the relentless, unyielding nature of the destruction. For the Germans, it was as if they were fighting an enemy that could see them, even when they couldn't see it. It was a form of warfare that left them no room to maneuver, no way to predict the incoming fire. Unlike traditional artillery, where soldiers could take shelter in the safety of bunkers or trenches, the proximity fuse struck from above, turning the very air into a weapon. The Germans had no way to fight back against it, no strategy to counter it, and no hope of stopping the relentless tide of destruction. The psychological impact was immense. German soldiers, some of whom had fought on the Eastern Front against the brutal Soviet forces, found themselves confronted by an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. There was no safety, no refuge from the proximity-fused shells that detonated overhead. It was as if the very air around them was alive with death, a force that couldn't be predicted, avoided, or escaped. The shock of it, the sheer unpredictability, caused confusion and panic among German ranks. The veteran soldiers, those who had once been unflinching in the face of artillery fire, found themselves paralyzed by fear. The psychological impact was immense. German soldiers, some of whom had fought on the Eastern Front against the brutal Soviet forces, found themselves confronted by an enemy that seemed to be everywhere at once. There was no safety, no refuge from the proximity-fused shells that detonated overhead. It was as if the very air around them was alive with death, a force that couldn't be predicted, avoided, or escaped. The shock of it, the sheer unpredictability, caused confusion and panic among German ranks. The veteran soldiers, those who had once been unflinching in the face of artillery fire, found themselves paralyzed by fear. But for the Allies, the proximity fuse was a game changer. It didn't just level the playing field. It tilted the balance of power firmly in their favor. The Allies, for the first time, had a weapon that was as close to a force of nature as a piece of technology could be. It wasn't just a tool of destruction. It was a weapon that could think, adapt, and deliver its payload with deadly precision. The psychological advantage it gave the Americans was enormous. They had the ability to strike without warning, without need for forward observers. They had a weapon that could decimate enemy ranks without ever needing to see the enemy. As the battle raged on, the Americans discovered that the proximity fuse wasn't just a powerful weapon, it was a symbol of their industrial might. The sheer scale of its production, the logistical effort behind getting millions of fuses into the hands of Allied artillery units, was nothing short of a miracle. In a time when resources were stretched thin and the war effort was pushing industrial capacities to their limits, the United States had managed to create and mass-produce a weapon that had changed the very nature of warfare. This industrial miracle wasn't just about the proximity fuse itself. It was about the broader implications of what it represented. It was the convergence of American innovation, industrial power, and military strategy. It was a reminder that the United States had not only the industrial might to produce the weapons needed to win the war, but the scientific ingenuity to create entirely new forms of warfare. The proximity fuse was just one example of how the U.S. was outpacing the Axis powers in terms of technological and industrial capabilities. The Germans, for all their technical expertise, couldn't keep up. Their reliance on outdated strategies and weapons left them vulnerable to the innovations of the Allies. The proximity fuse, which had initially seemed like a fanciful idea, had proven itself to be a revolutionary weapon that no one could have predicted. It wasn't just the destructive power of the shells that made them so effective. It was the way they changed the very rules of engagement. No longer could soldiers hide behind their typical defensive strategies. No longer could they count on entrenched positions to provide safety. The proximity fuse had rendered those tactics obsolete. It had created a battlefield where the traditional rules no longer applied. For the Allies, the impact of the proximity fuse was felt beyond the battlefield. As it became clear that this new weapon had turned the tide in the Battle of the Bulge, the morale of the American forces soared. They now had a weapon that could decisively shift the momentum in their favor, even when the odds seemed stacked against them. The success of the proximity fuse provided a glimmer of hope in a war that had been grinding on for years. For the first time in months, there was a feeling that victory might be within reach. But it wasn't just the military that was impressed by the proximity fuse's success. The weapon was a symbol of American ingenuity on the world stage. It showed the world that the United States had the technological prowess and industrial capability to create game-changing innovations. The Germans, despite their advanced technological capabilities, had failed to develop a comparable weapon. They had the knowledge, the experience, and the resources, but they lacked the ability to push their technologies to the next level. The proximity fuse was a demonstration of how American creativity and determination could outpace even the most established military powers. The tactical shift that occurred as a result of the proximity fuse was profound. It wasn't just about causing more casualties, it was about changing the way battles were fought. The fuse allowed the Americans to fight smarter, not harder. Instead of relying on sheer numbers or brute force, they now had a weapon that could make every shot count. The art of artillery had been transformed from a simple act of firing shells at the enemy into a precise science, where every shot could be calculated for maximum effect. This transformation wasn't just about the proximity fuse, though. It was about the way it represented a larger shift in how warfare was conducted. The proximity fuse was the first step in a revolution that would change not just the way battles were fought, but the entire approach to military technology. It was the beginning of an era where weapons could think for themselves, making decisions based on their environment. The proximity fuse was the first of many innovations that would eventually lead to the development of guided missiles, autonomous drones, and other smart weapons that dominate modern warfare. As the war raged on, the Allies continued to refine the use of the proximity fuse. It became an indispensable part of their arsenal, one that would help them win key battles in the final years of the war. The fuse's effectiveness was undeniable. It was a weapon that could neutralize enemy positions with deadly precision, leaving no place for the enemy to hide. It didn't just change the tactics on the ground, it changed the way wars were fought, making the battlefields of the future look entirely different from anything that had come before. The end of the Battle of the Bulge came as a bittersweet victory. While the Allies emerged victorious, the battle had cost both sides immensely, and the use of the proximity fuse marked a turning point in not just the battle, but the entire course of the war. The fuse had proven itself to be an unparalleled innovation, but its development came at a price with the loss of countless lives. And yet the legacy of the proximity fuse was far from over. As the Allies advanced into 1945, they carried the momentum of their success with them. The proximity fuse had rewritten the rules of artillery, making it one of the most effective weapons in their arsenal. But the true cost of this technological leap was felt in the months following the Battle of the Bulge. As German forces regrouped and attempted to adapt to the new realities of warfare, they found themselves faced with an enemy that had achieved what was once thought impossible. They were fighting against not only an army, but a force of industrial and scientific ingenuity. The Americans had proven that they could build weapons of mass destruction, and the proximity fuse was just the beginning. The psychological impact on the Germans was immense. It wasn't just about losing men. It was about losing confidence in their ability to fight. The proximity fuse had fundamentally changed how they viewed the battlefield. No longer could they rely on their traditional tactics of entrenched positions or defensive formations. The proximity fuse had negated the advantage of hiding in foxholes or behind trees. The enemy could now reach them from above with pinpoint accuracy. And for soldiers already worn down by years of brutal combat, the proximity fuse was a weapon that struck fear into their hearts. The reality of the war was sinking in for the German soldiers. It was no longer just about winning the battle, it was about survival. And survival became increasingly difficult as the Allies adapted and innovated faster than they could. The Germans had once prided themselves on their technological prowess, but the proximity fuse demonstrated the ability of the Allies to push technology to unprecedented levels of sophistication. It was a sobering realization for the German command. They had lost their technological edge, and they had no way of countering the relentless American artillery. The success of the proximity fuse was also a testament to the power of American industrial capability. The United States had the resources, the workforce, and the organizational know-how to mass-produce such a revolutionary weapon. The scale of production was staggering. Over the course of just a few months, the U.S. was able to churn out millions of proximity fuses, ensuring that American artillery units were equipped with them at a crucial moment in the war. The American industrial machine had proven itself to be just as powerful as its military forces. In a way, the proximity fuse symbolized the convergence of American might, technological, industrial, and military. The U.S. had created a weapon that would change the very nature of warfare. On the battlefield, the Allies were now able to strike with unprecedented precision. Proximity fuses allowed American artillery to hit targets that were once considered out of reach. Traditional artillery required forward observers to adjust fire, which was a time-consuming and often dangerous task. The proximity fuse eliminated the need for forward observers, as the shells could now detonate at the optimal height above their targets. This made artillery not just a support weapon, but a game-changer. It was now a weapon that could take the initiative, striking at the enemy's most vulnerable points without warning. For the German soldiers who were unlucky enough to be caught in the artillery barrage, there was little they could do to avoid the oncoming death. The proximity fuse didn't just destroy tanks or artillery, it destroyed morale. It shattered the will to fight. No longer could the Germans hide behind their defenses and hope to survive. The proximity fuse made the battlefield an open field for the Allies, one where every movement could be fatal. It forced the Germans into a defensive posture, unable to push forward or even hold their ground. This was evident in some of the most intense engagements of the war. The siege of Bastogne, for example, was a perfect demonstration of the fuse's effectiveness in a defensive role. Surrounded by German forces, the American troops in Bastogne relied on their artillery to hold the line. The 406th 3rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with proximity-fused shells, played a critical role in defending the town. The shells caused massive casualties among the attacking German forces, shattering their formations and forcing them to retreat. The proximity fuse turned what could have been a catastrophic defeat into a resounding victory for the Allies. The proximity fuse also had a significant impact on the psychological warfare being waged during the Battle of the Bulge. The German soldiers who faced this new weapon were terrified of it. They had never encountered anything like it. It wasn't just that they were facing an artillery barrage, it was that the barrage seemed to have an intelligence of its own. The proximity fuse created a sense of hopelessness and fear that was unmatched by anything the Germans had experienced before. The psychological toll of this new form of warfare was staggering. It wasn't just about the physical destruction. It was about the terror that the Germans experienced as they faced a weapon that seemed unstoppable. For the Allies, the psychological impact was just as profound, but in a different way. The proximity fuse gave them a sense of invincibility. They had a weapon that could change the course of the battle, a weapon that could neutralize the enemy's greatest strengths. The fuse was a symbol of American superiority, technologically, industrially, and militarily. It was a constant reminder to the Allies that they had the upper hand. It was a weapon that could level the playing field, even when the odds seemed against them. As the war drew to a close, the legacy of the proximity fuse continued to shape the future of warfare. The technology that had once seemed like science fiction was now a reality, and its principles would guide the development of future weapons. The fuse laid the groundwork for the smart weapons and precision-guided munitions that would dominate modern warfare. The ability to make weapons smarter, to give them the ability to detect and engage targets without human intervention, would change the way wars were fought in the decades to come. In many ways, the proximity fuse was the beginning of a new era in military technology. It marked the transition from conventional brute force warfare to a more precise and calculated form of combat. The proximity fuse represented the fusion of science, technology, and industry. It was a perfect example of how innovation could overcome the limitations of traditional warfare. And it was a harbinger of the future, one in which technological superiority would be the decisive factor in determining the outcome of wars. The Allied victory in the Battle of the Bulge, aided by the proximity fuse, was a pivotal moment in the war. It marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, as their forces were pushed back on all fronts. The proximity fuse had played a critical role in this victory, and its impact on the battlefield was undeniable. But its significance went far beyond just this battle. It was a symbol of the future of warfare, a future where technology would be the ultimate force on the battlefield. And as the Allies advanced, the Germans realized they had been outpaced by their enemies in more ways than one. It wasn't just the proximity fuse. They were up against a nation that could innovate faster, produce more efficiently, and adapt more quickly to the changing tides of war. The proximity fuse was just one example of the American ability to turn the tide of war in their favor through sheer technological superiority. It was a weapon that had redefined the battlefield, and its legacy would live on in the weapons of the future.